Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, executive editor of TNSR. It's frequent in American political discourse that we will hear people talk about tyranny or loss of freedoms. This week's episode of Horns should help to put those accusations in perspective. Nathan Law, this week's guest, in 2014 was a student leader of the Umbrella Movement in Hong Kong. In 2016, he was elected as Hong Kong's youngest ever parliamentarian. By 2017, he had been jailed by the Chinese government for his role in leading the Umbrella Movement, and in 2020, he went into exile and was ultimately granted asylum as someone who could not live in Hong Kong under the oppression of the national security law due to the dangers to his freedoms and his life posed by the Chinese government. Law joins Professor Sheena Greitens, director of the Asia Policy Program at the University of Texas, Austin, to discuss his book, Freedom: How We Lose It and How We Fight Back. This is a powerful first-person account of how a city went from the Pearl of the Orient and a beacon of freedom under the one country, two systems model to an example of an authoritarian state and the suppression of civil liberties and democracy. Indeed, as Law recounts, when he was given two different types of currency, one a Chinese renminbi and one a Hong Kong dollar, on his entry into Hong Kong, those two currencies represented more than two economic systems. They represented two different ideologies and two different sets of values about the rule of law. This is a powerful and entertaining discussion. Let's listen in.
Nathan Law is a Hong Kong activist, currently in exile and based in London. During the Umbrella Movement of 2014, he was one of 5 representatives who took part in dialogue with the government debating political reform. And then, upholding nonviolent civic action, he, Joshua Wong, and other student leaders founded a political party in 2016 and ran for the Legislative Council election. Nathan was elected with over 50,000 votes in the Hong Kong Island constituency, then became the youngest legislative councillor in history. His seat was overturned in July 2017 following Beijing's constitutional reinterpretation, despite widespread international criticism. Nathan was later jailed for his participation in the Umbrella Movement. His persecution sparked global concern over Beijing's crackdown on human rights and the democratic movement in Hong Kong. In 2018, Nathan and his fellow student activists, Joshua Wong and Alex Chow, were nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by U.S. congressmen and British parliamentarians. Due to the risk imposed by the draconian national security law, which some of you I know are interested in and have talked with me and other faculty about, Nathan left Hong Kong and continues to speak up for Hong Kong people on the international level. And he'll talk a little bit about some of that work today. In 2020, he was listed as one of the 100 most influential people in the world by Time. And I will say that having read his book carefully, it is a privilege to have someone who has experienced firsthand how quickly freedom can be taken away from us, who can speak compellingly about what it is like to lack freedom, and talk about both the dynamics of authoritarianism and our responsibilities as citizens and as individuals. So it's really an honor and a privilege to be able to have Nathan join us today to talk about these issues. Thank you so much for being with us, Nathan, and I'll turn it over to you. Welcome to UT virtually.
Well, thank you so much for the warm introduction and for inviting me from the Asia Policy Program from the UT at Austin. It's definitely my privilege to be able to talk to you all, no matter you're online or in person joining this event. For me, it's definitely a special feeling because I've never thought of myself as an English writer, but I indeed published a book in English. I wrote it in last January to August, and it was published in November 2021. It's actually a year since its publication, and I've been receiving a lot of positive feedbacks, good feedbacks, and a couple of recognition of the book. The name of the book is Freedom: How We Lose It and How We Fight Back. This is the cover of the US edition, and it talks about my story and also the story of Hong Kong. It talks about how freedom could be easily eroded with an unchecked power, but it also talks about how an individual can make an impact in the middle of this turmoil. And I think that format of writing was actually quite good in explaining things to people who are not initially interested in the affairs of Hong Kong and China, because initially when I wanted to write a book, I thought about autobiography. That was what I thought about when I took the plane out of Hong Kong in late June 2020, when the national security law was about to implement. But soon I realized that that would be a big book that would be a bit more boring, and people who are not very interested in these affairs may find difficulties to read it. So I decided to turn it into this format. Half of it is my story, and half of it is the city's story, and how freedoms are eroded in the setting. So why my story? And it comes to a lot of things about my story and how it resonates with the erosion of freedom, with the changing environment of my city, Hong Kong. In the past few years, I've been a very active political activist. In a lot of historical moments in Hong Kong about politics, I was involved. I was even in the center of it. In 2016, I was elected as the youngest parliamentarian, youngest congressman in Hong Kong. And before that, in 2014, I was a leader in the umbrella movement. In 2017, I was seated in jail. And in 2020, I went into a life of exile. Coincide with all those historic juncture, those were the moments that Hong Kong's freedom were eroded and its political diversity were diminished. And up to a moment when I had to leave Hong Kong, Hong Kong was turned into an authoritarian police state. So actually, the trajectory of my life was a mirror of the trajectory of Hong Kong in terms of how it's been changing in terms of politics and its society. And I found it fascinating. And that's why I think there is a parallel writing that can make more people to put into my shoe and also understand the change of Hong Kong in that landscape. When I talk about the story of Hong Kong, I started with my father's story, actually, in this book. In the very first chapter, I dedicated to my father, who swarmed to Hong Kong in late 70s when there were so much political and economic turmoil in mainland China, when the Cultural Revolution was coming to an end, but there were also famine problems that my father, in the peasant village of where my father lived, there were just no food. And the only hope and refuge for him was to escape to Hong Kong, which is quite far away if you consider he was living in the southern part of China. And he took a rough trip for 3 days, and he saw a lot of floating bodies on the open sea. And then he swam a bit and then landed in Hong Kong. Back then, when the Hong Kong government, which was still under the British colonial administration, when they were trying to cope with these immigrations from mainland China, because for the past 150 years, when Hong Kong was being ruled by the British government, its population growth was almost all by all those refugees and immigrations from mainland China when all these turmoils was going on there. When they wanted to cope with the immigration and these fleeting waves, they implemented a policy that we called the touch-based policy, which means that when you cross the border of Hong Kong, as long as you can evade, you can escape from the arrest of the border police, when you reach to the city center, then you are granted citizenship in Hong Kong. So my father was benefited from that policy, and he was almost a large patch of the people who were benefit from it. So in the late 70s, he came to Hong Kong. He find refuge in Hong Kong, and this is such a historical irony. In that time, Hong Kong was the hope for these people, but for now, Hong Kong is a despair. Hong Kong is a giant persecution machine that drives people away. And in my father's time, it was a safe haven. It was a place that accommodates refugees who are fleeing from political terror and economic strain. But for now, Hong Kong produces refugees like me that they drive people away because of political terror. So I introduced the whole idea of that parallel through these stories, because when I look back, it's such a waste, and a lot of us, a lot of Hong Kong people, especially the past generations, they are upset about the change of Hong Kong. And Hong Kong used to be so bright. We had a nickname of Hong Kong calling the Pearl of Orient in before, but for now, it's just such a authoritarian police state that the government persecute people just to stay in power and maintain full control. Things were not as bad as what we are having now in Hong Kong. I remember when I moved to Hong Kong, it was 1999, just after the handover, 2 years after the handover, when Hong Kong was handed back from the British government to the Chinese government in 1997. I knew nothing about Hong Kong. When I was crossing the border, that was the time my mother and the rest of us applied for one-way permit to relocate to Hong Kong, while my father was already a Hong Kong citizen, working in Hong Kong, earning higher salary than the average workers in mainland China, and to support my family in Shenzhen, which is the bordering city of Hong Kong. We decided to move to Hong Kong and live together. When I was crossing the border of Luowu, that was the border place, the immigration gate of Hong Kong to mainland China, my mother stuffed 2 bills in my pocket, and I pressed it carefully because I felt it was a fortune to me. 1 bill was renminbi, $50 sign, and the other was Hong Kong dollars, which was also $50 sign. These 2 bills actually represent 2 sets of system, 2 sets of currencies. But eventually, in the later part of my life, I realized that the differences between these 2 places and across the border was much more than 2 sets of currencies. It was 2 sets of ideas about power, 2 sets of systems, 2 sets of ideas about rule of law, about freedom, and also 2 ways of life, and 2 people in terms of history and identity. It was to my later stage of my life that I realized that the step that I made, the act of crossing the border, really impacted my life completely. And that was never out of my intention. I grew up in a blue-collar family. My father was a construction worker. My mother was a street cleaner. I had never thought about becoming a politician or activist. My parents didn't have any home education about freedoms or human rights or any relevant concepts. What all I was taught about was trying to get into college, graduate, find a good job, and climb up the social ladder. And I also consider my parents having what I called refugee mentality, which they understand that how terrible the Chinese Communist Party is, because that was the regime that drove them away. But they never wanted the sons or daughters to fight against them, because they felt like it is impossible to win over them, and also they just want stability. So stability triumphs everything. That's the way that they approach the question. So when I was growing up, I didn't have any concept about becoming a dissident or any human rights problems in mainland China. And to 2008, I was even cheering for the success of China. In that year, that was the honeymoon period of Hong Kong to China. That was the peak of Hong Kong people identifying themselves as Chinese. And that is an indicator of the rating that they give to the Chinese government. In that year, when the Beijing Olympics started, that was seen as the most successful soft power campaign of China. And it influenced the whole Hong Kong. When I was living in that public housing estate, I also watched live of Beijing Olympics. And whenever the Chinese national team won a medal or they climbed up the medal ladder, we cheered for them. We felt happy for them. And to a certain extent, we felt proud. Hong Kong people were so supportive to the Beijing Olympics. And also that there was the Sichuan earthquake, a lot of terrible disasters in China in that year. And Hong Kong people donate millions of money, millions of Hong Kong dollars to help to rebuild And those were the time when there were not much Hong Kong-China conflict, and Hong Kong people were actually not marching down to the streets to express discontent. But after that, things changed. We saw a lot of corruptions after all these earthquake incidents. We saw a lot of human rights abuses. We saw Xi Jinping came in power and destroy the whole civil society in mainland China. And for me, I also came into a place that I started to be aware more about human rights and freedom. One of the enlightenment moment was when I was in high school in 2010. Liu Xiaobo, the Nobel Peace laureate, the only Chinese Nobel Peace Prize laureate in 2010, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And when I heard about the news, I didn't know who he was, and I didn't know what was he working on. But as a very apolitical high school student, all I could think of is it should be a good thing, because he was. I knew that people who got Nobel Prize are the people who are excellent in that field. So I was actually happy for him. But in reality, on the next day, when my school principal, which was really pro Beijing, when she speak on the morning assembly, she publicly discredited and criticized Liu Xiaobo and saying that he's not loyal to the country enough. He despises intellectuals, etc. And by then, I was very curious, because I thought he was a person who should be glorified. But how come he was being stigmatized and criticized in that way? So I went back home and then and started to Google about his work. And that opened up a door for me to understand his work on human rights and democracy in mainland China. And the next year, in 2012, I went for the first time to the 4th of June candlelight vigil, which it commemorates the Tiananmen massacre in 1989 and all those 89 democratic movements spread across China. And I was really moved by the spirit of the students fighting for democracy, open government, anti-corruption in 1989. And it really coined the kind of mentality of me and the basic value system of me when I approached to a coming year of age, which is in my university, which when I was a freshman, to first be involved in political movement. So in 2014, when I was a student leader, when I was a freshman in the university, I ran for a seat in the student union. And in that year, it coincides with one of the critical junctures of Hong Kong history, which in that year, Hong Kong people were trying to fight for universal suffrage, trying to fight for democracy from Beijing. And every one of us felt that was the promise Beijing gave to Hong Kong people, and we want them to deliver it. In the 1980s, when the British government and Chinese government were negotiating Hong Kong's future, Hong Kong people were actually not part of it. We had never been able to make a say or to decide our future, not in the 80s and not now. But then, when Hong Kong was still a very important economy to China, when Hong Kong people were so terrified about being governed by a Chinese communist regime, because they were everything opposite of the Hong Kong in the 80s. Well, the economic system, the rule of law, the social system, the protection to private properties, all sorts of things. Hong Kong people were terrified about being governed by that regime. So in the 80s and 90s, there were a couple of waves of immigration. Hong Kong people went to Canada, went to Australia, just because of the anxiety of the handover in 1997. And also in the 90s, it was under the shadow of the Tiananmen massacre. So back then, in order to appease Hong Kong people, Beijing gave some promises under the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which was the treaty signed by the Chinese government and the British government to oversee Hong Kong's governance after 1997. In the one country, two system design, there are few core elements of Hong Kong. First of all, freedom, autonomy, rule of law, and democracy. Hong Kong people see these pillars of one country, two system as the promises of Beijing, and only by fulfilling these promises, Hong Kong people's rights could be protected. And that was the initial idea of one country, two system. The existence of two countries is to protect Hong Kong people. But in 2014, we felt a huge sense of betrayal because Beijing literally says that we will never give you genuine democracy. We allow you to vote for leaders, but it is under our supervision. And also we choose who you can vote for, which means that we don't have genuine choice. We don't have a free choice. And that really upset a lot of Hong Kong people. Not only we want democracy, but also we felt a deep sense of betrayal. So at that time, the massive civil disobedience emerged, the umbrella movement in 2014, which I was heavily involved and which I was seen as one of the student leaders, took place. Hundreds of thousands of Hong Kong people marched to the streets and occupy major runways. One of the most important implications of the umbrella movement was it was the very first large-scale civil disobedience actions of Hong Kong people. Before the umbrella movement, we were not welcome. We didn't welcome the idea that we can break the law in order to achieve justice. We felt like Hong Kong was a city where all the citizens are law-abiding ones. So we didn't have the idea of civil disobedience, which sometimes you have to break an unjust law to make a point and to obstruct the operation of the city in order to force the government to give concession. And that was the whole idea behind the umbrella movement. And that was the very first time the idea of civil disobedience was really seated, was really planted in Hong Kong people's hearts. But at the end of the day, it failed to achieve its demands. But the idea of a thriving civil society was still there. And after the civil disobedience, after the umbrella movement, people continue to be involved in civil affairs, protest, and continue to be part of the civil society. For me, I continue to stay in student union, and then I found my own political party with other student activists, student leaders like Joshua Wong, Anna Chow, Ivan Lam. I ran for the election in 2016 in Hong Kong Island, which was the most educated, the most aged, with the wealthiest constituency in Hong Kong. In the beginning, I was seen as an underdog. I remember that a month before the election, it was a proportional elections. There were 15 list of candidates competing 6 seats. So it was a severely contested region. In that, a month before the election, I think I was up 1% supporting rates. I was almost the bottom of the whole teams. I think it was generally because the voters considered that I was not experienced. I didn't have enough experience. I was not mature enough. I was a protest leader, but don't know about policy. And I was just a student in university when the other predecessors, they were government officials, honorable lawyers, intellectuals, etc. So I was not their profile of legislator, but through months of campaign and also performing in the debates, public debate with the other candidates, I could really prove that the lack of experience could also mean that I have new ideas about the city. I also proved that I can chant slogans in protest, but I can also talk about real politics, talk about policies. And most importantly, I proved that there's a need in the council that we need young faces and fresh voice. So I was elected with second highest vote in the constituency and became the youngest legislator at the age of 23. By then, Hong Kong legislature were still half democratic, semi-democratic. We've got half of the seats that are through direct election, and the other half of them were mostly reserved for the pro-Beijing side. So even though whenever we enter into election, the pro-democracy camp have always been the majority. We've always got around 60% of the vote, but we have always been minority in the council due to the particular design. But now, of course, the government overhauled the election system and introduced a new one, which there's only 10% of the seats that are through popularly contested election, which means that there are no meaningful participation from the pro-democracy camp. And that's after the 2020 implementation of the national security law. So in 2016, I was elected, but in 2017, I was unseated due to Beijing's intervention. And then I was jailed a month afterwards. These two incidents also triggered a lot of international outcry. And they were the signs that Beijing was actually starting to really clamp down the Hong Kong, the political diversity of Hong Kong, targeting prominent activists that they consider a threat to them, and also controlling the whole Hong Kong civil society and basically the freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. And after serving jail term for almost 3 months, it is actually relatively short compared to the ones that we are witnessing now, that the protesters are being sentenced now. I finished my bachelor degree. I took some time to rethink about my future, and then I applied for a master degree in overseas. And then here it comes, the 2019 protest movement. The protest movement was undoubtedly the largest one in Hong Kong's history. The peak of it was on 16th June 2019, when there were 2 million of Hong Kong people marching down the street. Just try to imagine, Hong Kong is a city with 7.5 million population. There were more than a quarter of the population on the street. If it is taking place in any of the major cities in the US or even the whole US, things would change immediately, just like a glimpse. The government will collapse, they will give in, and all the demands of protesters will be met. But that's not the case in Hong Kong. After the protest, the government continued to say that we are going to introduce the widely opposed extradition bill that allows the Hong Kong government to extradite fugitives from Hong Kong to mainland China, which it was seen as a persecution to political activists in Hong Kong. And the police violence escalated. The government turned into a crackdown mode, and tens of thousands of people arrested, injured, and ended up, for now, thousands of them are being trialed and are on the process of going to jail. So this is a sad page of Hong Kong, but it also reflects that if you look at the trajectory of how Beijing governed Hong Kong, in the first 10 years of the one country, two system, it was seen as a honeymoon period. And then here it comes a more turbulent period when Xi Jinping was getting power. When he cemented his crown in 2012, late 2012, he introduced the foreign NGO laws in mainland China. The civil society in mainland China basically collapsed and vanished. And that trend inherent to Hong Kong. And we saw a complete crackdown of the civil society after 2020, when the national security law was implemented. All the free media that are critical to the government were disbanded. Political organizations, dozens of them, were disbanded. The largest workers, the Independent Workers Union, Teachers Union, all of them, under the threat of the national security law, disappeared. So it's really clear that there have been changes in how Beijing treated Hong Kong, and it also correlates to Beijing's Beijing's ambition on how they see China. In 90s, in 20s, the foreign policy of hide and bait, Tao Guang Yang Hui, becoming a really benign and humble player on the international stage. When China adopted that set of idea, Hong Kong was seen as a target that they should meet. One country, two system. It meant one country moving gradually to two system. Hong Kong was an example of liberalism, of how a city, a country could thrive with a civil and open society. But eventually, when China repositioned themselves, when the Chinese Communist wanted to say that we no longer need your guidance, we no longer need to be seen as a benign player in the national stage. We wanted to be the greatest and most powerful one. And we also feel like democracy, freedom, liberties, narrative don't fit us. Our totalitarian model is the best one, and we have to maintain that. And we will create a global system that allows us to thrive under that system. So that the example of Hong Kong, the example of a civil society and open society, no longer is in need. And that's why Beijing had no reservation of destroying what makes Hong Kong special and unique, and to make it just an ordinary Chinese city. And that's what happened in the past few years. So that was also a set picture, a set puzzle in the whole program of the global democratic recession at least for the past 15 years, when democracy everywhere is at risk, when the rise of authoritarianism, with the rise of these totalitarian and authoritarian countries corrupting, eroding our personal freedoms and these cities system, and also the value system of democracy all around the world. I believe that democracy has come to a very dangerous moment, which we need to amass enough resources to counter and blunt these authoritarian regimes' expansion nature. For me, at the end of the book, I talk about activism. I talk about what is it like to become an activist. I talk about activism, not necessarily to become an activist or a politician or quit your day job and join an NGO. I define activism as someone who devotes part of their life to a higher cause that achieve betterment in the society. So no matter who you are and what occupations that you are in, as long as you have your expertise and you can contribute to the movement, for example, if you are a graphic designer, you design a poster for an organization that you like. If you are an IT guy, you provide that expertise to set up an internet, to set up a website, and so provides, let's say, firewall that blocks hackers from attacking those websites to the civil society. And I think that's the starting point of us, how we should be involved in social affairs and how we should position ourselves. I also believe that young people are the spearhead of change in the society, that we are in the time when we don't have the family burden, when we don't have to be in all the chores and all the work life, and we can freely explore ideas and talk with like-minded allies in school and being guided by professors about how we can get involved. This is a better time of being involved in activism, and that's why I strongly support people to be involved in student activism. And at the end chapter, I talk about what I think are the characteristics and the things that you could become a better activist, to be more to have more empathy, more understanding, and to be able to bring more changes in the society. So I pretty much covered all the main theme of the book about my personal stories and all the critical junctures that I've been through. I've been through lots of unexpected turns in my life, and I had never thought about myself becoming an activist or even to become a legislator, a political prisoner, and now an exiled activist. But I've never regretted anything that I've involved, because I think this is the only path that is the most valuable possible in all those alternative paths of mine. So I'm really glad that I can continue to speak up for my Hong Kong fellows, continue to remind everyone how fragile freedoms are and how important democracy is, and continue to spread the words of the people, especially for my dearest friends in jail.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.